Today I'm going to be reading from one of my favorite authors, C.S. Lewis. Lewis is the author of many famous works, including the Chronicles of Narnia, and he's written extensively on how morality, which is the topic we've been discussing, how morality actually can be used to prove the existence of God. So I'm going to be reading from his book, Mere Christianity, the first 4 chapters. It might take me a few videos to do, so I'm going to try and read the first 2 chapters right now. Right and wrong as a clue to the meaning of the universe. Chapter 1 is entitled The Law of Human Nature. Everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny, and sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant. But however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the things that people say. They say things like this. How'd you like it if someone did the same thing to you? That's my seat. I was here first. Leave him alone. He hasn't done anything to you. Why should you shove in first? Give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Come on, you promised. People say things like this every day. Educated people as well as uneducated people. Children as well as grown-ups. Now, what interests me about all of these remarks is that the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He's appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. The other man very seldom replies, "To hell with your standard." Nearly always, he just tries to make out that what he's been doing does not really go against the standard and make some kind of excuse. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play or decent behavior or morality, whatever you want to call it, about which they really agreed, and they have. If they had not, they might, of course, fight like animals, but they could not quarrel in the human sense of the word. Quarreling, after all, means trying to show that the other man is in the wrong. And there would be no sense in trying to do that unless you had some sort of agreement as to what right and wrong are. Just as there would be no sense in saying that a footballer had committed a foul unless there was some agreement about the rules of football. Now, this law, or rule about right and wrong, used to be called the law of nature. Nowadays, when we talk about the laws of nature, we usually mean things like gravitation or heredity or the laws of chemistry. But when the older thinkers called the law of right or wrong the law of nature, they really meant the law of human nature. The idea was, just as bodies are governed by the law of gravitation and organisms by biological laws, so the creature called man also had his law, with this great difference that a body could not choose whether it obeyed the law of gravitation or not, but a man could choose either to obey the law of human nature or disobey it. We may put it another way. Each man is at every moment subjected to several different sets of law, but there's only one of which he is free to disobey. As a body, he's subjected to gravitation and cannot disobey it. If you leave him unsupported in midair, he has no more choice about falling than a stone has. As an organism, he is subjected to various biological laws which he cannot disobey any more than an animal can. That is, he cannot disobey those laws which he shares with other things, but the law which is peculiar to his human nature, the law he does not share with animals or vegetables or inorganic things, is the one he can disobey if he chooses. This law was called the law of nature because people thought that everyone knew it by nature and did not need to be taught it. Now, they did not mean, of course, that you might not find an odd individual here or there who did not know it, just as you find a few people who are colorblind or have no ear for a tune. But taking a race as a whole, they thought that the human idea of decent behavior was obvious to everyone. And I believe they were right. If not, then all things we said about the war were nonsense. What was the sense in saying the enemy were in the wrong unless right is a real thing which the Nazis at bottom knew as well as we did and ought to have practiced? If they had no notion of what we mean by right, then though we might still have had to have fought them, we can no more have blamed them for that than for the color of their hair. I know that some people say the idea of the law of nature or decent behavior known to all men is unsound because different civilizations at different ages have had quite different moralities. But this is not true. It's never amounted to a total difference. If anyone will take the trouble to compare the moral teachings of, say, the ancient Egyptians, Babylonians, Hindus, Chinese, Greeks, and Romans, what will really strike them is about how similar they are to each other and to our own. Our present purpose, I need only ask the reader to think what a total difference of morality would actually mean. Think of a country where people admired people for running away in battle, or where a man felt proud of double-crossing all the people who had been kindest to him. You might as well just try to imagine a country where 2 and 2 made 5. Men have differed in regards to what people you ought to be unselfish to, whether it was to your own family, your fellow countrymen, or everyone, but they've always agreed that you ought not to put yourself first. Selfishness has never been admired. Men have differed as to whether you should have 1 wife or 4, but they've always agreed you should not simply have any woman that you liked. But the most remarkable thing is this. Whenever you find a man who says he does not believe in a right or wrong, you'll find the same man going back on this a moment later. He may break his promise to you, but if you try breaking one to him, he'll be complaining it's not fair before you can say Jack Robinson. seems then we're forced to believe in a real right and wrong. People may be sometimes mistaken about them, just as sometimes people are mistaken about their sums when doing multiplication. But they're not merely a matter of taste and opinion any more than multiplication is. Now, if we are agreed about this, I go on to my next point, which is none of us are really keeping the law of nature. Heaven knows I don't pretend to be better than anyone else. I'm only trying to call to attention a fact, the fact that this year, or this month, or more likely this very day, we have all failed to practice ourselves the kind of behavior we expect from other people, and there may be all sorts of excuses for us, but I'm not here merely to make excuses. Now, I do not succeed in keeping the law of nature very well, and the moment anyone tells me I'm not keeping it, there starts up in my mind a string of excuses as long as my arm. The question at the moment is not whether they are good excuses. The point is that, excuses themselves are one more proof of how deeply, whether we like it or not, we believe in the law of nature. If we do not believe in decent behavior, why should we be so anxious to make excuses for not having behaved decently? The truth is we believe in decency so much, we feel the rule of law pressing us so, that we cannot bear to face the fact that we are breaking it, and consequently we try to shift the responsibility. For you'll notice that it is only when our bad behavior, when we're behaving poorly, that we find all these explanations and excuses. It's only for our bad temper that we put down to being tired or worried or hungry, but for our good temper, we put it down to ourselves. These then are the 2 points I want to make. First, that human beings all over the earth have this curious idea that they ought to behave in a certain way, and cannot really get rid of it. Secondly, that they do not in fact behave in that way. They know the law of nature, they break it. These 2 facts are the foundation of all clear thinking about ourselves and the universe we live in. Chapter 1. Chapter 2, called Objections. Some of the letters I have had show that a good many people find it difficult to understand just what the law of human nature, or moral law, or rule of decent behavior is. For example, some people wrote to me saying, isn't what you call the moral law simply our herd instinct, and hasn't it been developed just like our other instincts over time, like evolution? Now, I do not deny that we may have a herd instinct, but that is not what I mean by moral law. We all know what it feels like to be prompted by instinct, by mother love or sexual instinct or the instinct for food. It means that you feel a strong want or desire to act in a certain way, and of course we sometimes do feel that sort of desire to help another person. And no doubt that desire is due to the herd instinct. But feeling a desire to help is quite different from feeling that you ought to help whether you want to or not. Supposing you hear a cry for help from a man in danger, you will probably feel 2 desires. One, a desire to give help due to your herd instinct, and other to keep out of danger due to the instinct of self-preservation. But you'll find inside you, in addition to these 2 impulses, a third thing which tells you which you ought to follow, the impulse to help and suppress the impulse to run away. Now this thing that judges between 2 instincts, that decides which should be encouraged, cannot itself be either of them. You might as well say that the sheet of music which tells you at a given moment to play one note on the piano and not another is itself one of the notes on the keyboard. The moral law tells us the tune we have to play, and our instincts are merely the keys. Another way of seeing that the moral law is not simply one of our instincts is this. If 2 instincts are in conflict, and there's nothing in a creature's mind except those 2 instincts, obviously the stronger of the 2 must win. But at those moments when we are most conscious of the moral law, it usually seems to be telling us to side with the weaker of the 2 impulses. You probably want to be safe much more than you want to help the man who is drowning, but the moral law tells you to help him all of the same. And surely it often tells us to try to make the right impulse stronger than it naturally is. I mean, we often feel it our duty to stimulate the herd instinct by waking up our imaginations and arousing our pity and so on, so as to get up enough steam for doing the right thing. But clearly we're not acting from instinct when we set about making the instinct stronger than it is. The thing that tells you your herd instinct is asleep, wake it up, cannot itself be the herd instinct. The thing that tells you which note on the piano needs to be played louder cannot itself be that note. Here's the third way of seeing it. If the moral law was one of our instincts, we ought to be able to point to some one impulse inside of us, which always is good, and is always in agreement with the rule of right behavior, but you cannot. There is none of our impulses which the moral law may not sometimes tell us to suppress, and none which it may not sometimes tell us to encourage. It is therefore a mistake to think that some of our impulses, say mother love or patriotism, are good, and others like sex or the fighting instinct are bad. All we mean is that the occasions on which the fighting instinct or the sexual desire need to be restrained are rather more frequent than those for restraining mother love or patriotism. But there are situations in which it is the duty of a married man to encourage his sexual impulse, or of a soldier to encourage the fighting instinct. There are also occasions on which a mother's love for her own children or a man's love for his own country have to be suppressed, or they will lead to an unfairness towards other people's children or countries. Surely speaking, there are no such things as good and bad impulses. Think once again of a piano. It has not got 2 kinds of notes on it, the right notes and the wrong notes. every single note is right at one time and wrong at another. The moral law is not any one instinct or any one set of instinct. It is something which makes a kind of tune, the tune we call goodness or right conduct, by directing the instincts. I think this is C.S. Lewis' most important point so far. The most dangerous thing you can do is take any one impulse of your own nature and set it up as the thing you ought to follow at all costs. There is not one of them which will not make us into devils if we set it up as an absolute guide. You might think love of humanity in general is safe, but it's not. If you leave out justice, you'll find yourself breaking agreements and faking evidence in trials for the sake of humanity, and become in the end a cruel and treacherous man. No single impulse or instinct within us is good or bad, which means even in a collection of humans, all the impulses put together are not good or bad. Rather, the way we ought to use our impulses is good or bad, which means good or bad must be external to all of our impulses, which means it's not natural. It's a law external to us.